Well, hello and welcome. It's been another 2 weeks, and here we are again with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint Live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. If you're not familiar with the Alliance, I started the Alliance about 3 years ago to raise awareness about the issue of restraint and seclusion that was happening in schools across the country. Every day, our mission seems to grow. While we are very concerned about the use of restraint and seclusion, we're also concerned with all the other things that are happening to kids, often very punitive things, in the name of behavior. So we see restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. All of those things are things that we want to see changed. And of course, we don't want to see people being restrained or secluded in any environment, whether it's a school, whether it's a medical setting, whether it's behavioral health, mental health, a ranch, whatever it may be. We really want to help influence a change in minds, laws, hearts, and laws and minds, all of that, to see safer schools for students, teachers, and staff, but also to see safety in other environments and better supporting environments. So today I am very excited to have Dr. Erin Hambrick joining us. Dr. Hambrick is the Director of Research for the ChildTrauma Academy. Dr. Hambrick is going to be talking about the Neurosequential Model. The Neurosequential Model is a developmentally sensitive, neurobiologically informed approach to clinical problem solving. The model was developed by Dr. Bruce Perry, and Dr. Bruce Perry is obviously well known in the trauma world, but also for new books like he has the Boy That Was Raised as a Dog, and of course, What Happened to You, along with Oprah Winfrey. And of course, what we're going to be talking about is the neurosequential model, which is not a specific therapeutic technique or intervention, but it's an approach that integrates kind of core principles of neurodevelopment and trauma to inform work with children, families, and communities in which they live. I will tell you that if you have questions today during the presentation, I've agreed with Dr. Hambrick that you can ask those questions anytime. So as you bring up questions, I will be on the lookout and we will ask them as they come up here. So feel free to put those in the chat and we will try to address those as they come. I want to let you know, as always, today's session is being recorded. So you'll be able to watch it again after the fact on Facebook, YouTube, and we also make it available as an audio podcast. So with all that said, let's get straight to our guest, because I am very, very excited today about our guest, Dr. Hambrick. So first of all, I want to welcome you, and I'm going to give a little bit of your background here.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and give a short introduction here. You, of course, are the Director of Research for the ChildTrauma Academy and an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and an associate editor for the Journal of Child and Family Studies. You work with children and families who have faced adversities, study treatment options to best fit their strengths and needs. We talk about a lot of different approaches here to better supporting kids and families. We try to raise a lot of awareness about the different alternatives. Really have long wanted to learn more about the neurosequential model. I know that there have been schools in the nation that have used it, but in other settings as well. So we are thrilled to have you here today, and really happy you're joining us.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that there's interest in the model, and hope that I can provide some information and also pique interest.
Absolutely. So with that, I know you have a presentation, and we were talking a few minutes ago and decided, not only is it great to do a presentation, but it's great to have some interaction from the audience. So rather than making everybody wait till the end and hold on to their questions, you've agreed to take questions as we go.
Yep.
So I'm going to bring up here in a moment your slide deck so you can begin to go ahead and hit the play button on it, but I'll bring that up in a second.
All right.
And when I do, I'll let you take over the presentation. But as questions come up, or you've said you don't mind if I interrupt you with an occasional question or comment
Actually,
as
I
well.
would like it, because sometimes you
Okay.
feel like you're just speaking into the void, So
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely hear you. And it's nice to have a little bit of interaction. So at least I'll make some noise every now and then so you know that I'm there. All right. So I'm bringing your presentation up on the screen right now. And if you want to go ahead and hit the play mode, I know at that point you will just see your presentation. But I assure you that I am here, and we've got a number of people that are watching live. So I will let you go ahead and take it away and jump in as we get questions, or I have random thoughts that are running across my brain.
No, perfect. That will
Thank
be
you.
great. Well, so I'm here to talk a little bit about the neurosequential model, kind of some of the underpinnings of the model, and why it is that an approach like this might be relevant when we talk about decreasing seclusion and restraint, becoming less punitive, becoming more strengths focused, preventing problems before they happen. Those are reasons certainly that I get excited about the neurosequential model. The model is really based in helping to meet kids where they are, and learning about what happened to them, to quote, I guess, the title of Dr. Perry and Oprah's book, so that we can figure out what we might do to support their best possible trajectory. So there's a lot to the neurosequential model, so I'm having to just pick and choose things to talk about. And so that's part of why I really want to hear from you all if you have questions as they come up, because in some ways I'll be skipping around a little bit, and if things aren't connecting, I'll certainly want to connect those dots. So something I like to do that, I don't know, might annoy my students a little bit, is that before I kind of get to the crux of what I want to talk about, I do want to provide some background, because I think that can make the model and its relevance to decreasing the likelihood that children will get punished just make a lot more sense. So I want to back up a little bit to what I refer to as the developmental psychopathology framework. I don't really like the term psychopathology, but that's what the framework is called. The idea here is that people who study developmental psychopathology say, yes, absolutely, children come into the world with a certain genetic makeup, with a certain biology. But in order for them to become who they are, they have to have life experiences. We actually require life experience to develop to our fullest potential. And the beauty of that is that we come into the world really ready to learn about the environment we're born into so that we can adapt to it to the best possible degree. The downside of that is that when we have life experiences that aren't optimal, that are traumatic, that are neglectful, that are maltreating, that can have a significant influence on how we develop. That tells us in our earliest days, hey, watch out for this. Don't develop in that way because it might disadvantage you in some way. And so we know that developmental experience really shapes outcomes. It has a huge influence in terms of who we will become. But something that makes this all hard when it comes to understanding individual children and responding to the sometimes big behaviors that children can show and can express is that you can have the very different life experiences and end up showing and expressing the same behaviors, depression or aggression, for example. You could also have really similar life experiences and end up showing very different outcomes from someone else who had similar life experience. There are so many variables that matter. How old were you when the bad things happened? How much support did you have around you when those bad things happened? How chronic was the experience? All of those sorts of variables can really shape the very unique people that we become. And, I am talking about trauma because the neurosequential model was really, I think initially, at least in my understanding, I wasn't the developer, but was really kind of developed in response to this question: how do we help children who've experienced significant trauma and stressors? And what we know is that children with trauma histories, especially early life trauma histories, are overrepresented in terms of their likelihood to experience seclusion or restraint, in terms of their likelihood to be involved with juvenile justice, with special education, with child welfare, for example. And so I think there is a lot of crossover here between these populations of children that we're talking about. Of course, it's not only children with histories of trauma who experience seclusion and restraint, but lots and lots of children who do have significant trauma histories.
Yeah, we find that very much to be the case that, when we talk about kids that are being restrained and secluded, it's very often, we know statistically it's more often than not kids with disabilities, Black and brown children, very young children, and very often children with a trauma history. And of course, the use of these interventions then further traumatizes kids, and
Absolutely.
the cycle is just really devastating. I do want to let you know that we've got people joining us from all over the world here. We've got people
Awesome.
from Scotland and Texas and Kentucky and all over. And I hope some of your students are watching
I know
as
the
well.
Kentucky people, they might be related to me. I don't know.
There you go. There you go. You have some roots in Kentucky then. Georgetown, Kentucky, actually.
Yep.
Oh, there you go. Well, hold on. Wait. Willow Hambrick.
Yeah, I know her.
That sounds familiar. So that's great. That's great. Absolutely. And Ohio. So, and I hope some of your students are on, and hopefully will introduce themselves as well. And, I mean, maybe not any extra credit in it for them, but,
Right.
knowing they're watching is good, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's always extra credit to be had.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thanks for making that connection, because again, these punitive things that are happening to so many kids are so commonly happening to kids with that trauma history. And it just
Yeah.
continues that. Yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway,
absolutely. Well, and all the factors that you brought up as well, disability, Black and brown children, we also see higher rates of traumatic stressors in those populations as well, and so, so I think it's an important population to talk about, and it's important, I think, for interventions that are developed to help children with trauma histories to really pay attention to the fact that because the trauma happened, then that places them at more risk for future negative things to happen, potentially like a seclusion or a restraint. So interestingly, most people I think are familiar with this concept. We just don't think about it that much. Really, stress in and of itself is not bad. Stress is not something that we should be afraid of. And when we talk about that developmental psychopathology model, really, we need the world to show us that it's a little bit stressful so that we can build resilience to the daily types of stresses that we are going to face, and when you're first born, that's a little bit stressful. You're seeing light for the first time. You're cold for the first time. And that first moment when somebody comes up and offers you a warm blanket, your stress response is soothed and you learn, I can handle this stress. There's something in my environment that can help me through this. And the next time you feel cold, it's not as frightening anymore. You don't feel as vulnerable. And so stress that's predictable, moderate, controlled can really build resilience. So stress is not necessarily the enemy, but stress that's unpredictable and severe and prolonged can lead to significant vulnerability. It leads to an organism, a person, adapting to a world that they don't really trust has their back. Adapting to a world where they're thinking, what, I always need to be on alert to make sure that something bad doesn't happen to me. I need to be really independent and take care of myself because I can't trust the world to do things for me.
If I can jump in with a quick
Yeah,
question from the audience, and I think this is a really good kind of foundational question.
yeah,
Tamika asked, if you can define trauma, and I know we can look at a lot of different definitions here,
mhm,
and I know that sometimes we find trauma being added to everything, and the
mhm,
idea that people aren't really understanding, not every, yeah, well,
yeah.
everything becomes trauma informed when in fact it really isn't.
I
Can you
know what
can
you
you kind
mean.
of define trauma through the lens of what we're talking about with the
Yeah.
neurosequential model?
Yeah. With the neurosequential model, we typically talk about trauma kind of similarly to SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, their definition of trauma, where we think of 3 E's. It's the event, it's something that happens to you. It's your experience of it, right? Because Guy, you could have an event happen, and I could have the same event happen, and we might experience it very differently. I might experience it as highly threatening, and I don't know, maybe you've built resilience to that sort of thing, and it isn't as stressful to you. So, event and how you experience it based on your past history, your biology, a number of things can play into how you might experience it, and then the effects of it. Right. So if later on there is some sort of typically negative effect it might be easier to define what happened as traumatic. Of course, this is all very nuanced when you get into it because, you can actually have things like post-traumatic growth following a traumatic stressor. But really, we're talking about life events that are experienced as out of one's control, as highly stressful, that tend to lead to some sort of change in how the person functions. Sometimes that change is positive, but unfortunately, lots of times that change can be negative as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So developmental trauma can lead to a multitude of different outcomes depending on the pattern, the timing, the duration, and the severity of experience. And the way that people react and respond is highly unique to them, highly individualized. And part of what makes working with children who've been trauma exposed so hard is that you can't make a lot of assumptions. You really need to get to know the person, what their community is like, what their family is like, what their school environment is like, and what their past history has been like in order to successfully work with them. And so, the impact of trauma on a child's developmental functioning might end up looking like mental health problems, might look like, I use the air quotes a lot of times, non-compliance, right? Somebody asks a child to do something and they don't do it. And we very quickly say, oh, that's non-compliance, right? Well, I don't know, maybe it's an organism that has adapted to a world where, bad things happen and they're kind of looking out for themselves saying, I don't know if I want to do what this person's asked me to do. Manipulation, I'll use air quotes there too, right? These tend to be the labels we put on to children that don't, I think, well define the intent or the purpose of a behavior that they're engaging in. Could look like aggression, withdrawal, social problems, really, and unfortunately, this list could kind of go on and on. Of course, I never want to lose sight of resilience. And in fact, the most common outcome, especially of a single incident trauma or stressor, is resilience. But typically, if we are using the neurosequential model, if we are using a model that, as you'll see in a few slides, really requires a lot of training to get certified in, typically we're talking about kids that have had things happen over and over and over again. And unfortunately, the outcome has become not very adaptive. The kid is having trouble learning in school because they're more focused on their current safety, for example. So I just want to bring this to life a little bit here. So this is a slide from a study that Dr. Perry and Thomas Bronner and I did a couple of years ago. We had about 800 kids who we knew a lot about their developmental history. And we wanted to know the relative impact of traumas experienced early in life compared to traumas experienced later in life. Now, you can experience a trauma at any point in your life, and it can be very challenging and lead to change in the way that you react and respond to the world. But what we found, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see that floating around?
No, I don't. There's
Okay.
a way to do it, but
No,
unfortunately.
that's all right. We don't have
Okay.
to. I'll just use my words.
Yeah, in the bottom right of your screen, I think if you mouse over, you'll see a little pencil, and I think you could actually draw or circle things. But
Maybe I can.
that could go very wrong. But give it a try, and we'll
No,
see what happens.
actually, I think I do see the pen. Okay.
Okay.
So what we found, we looked across a bunch of different developmental time periods in children's life: intrauterine, when they're in the womb; perinatal, those first few months of life; perinatal right here. Hopefully, you can see that being circled. Infancy, about the first year of life; early childhood, the first couple of years of life, on through childhood. And we were looking to see in kids who were currently 11 to 13, at what point in life were traumas more relatively detrimental to their current functioning, like their current self-control, their current problem-solving capabilities, their current mental health functioning? And we actually found that traumas occurring really just in the first few months of life were highly influential in terms of how children aged 11 to 13 were currently functioning. So you see kind of this negative correlation there. Now, that's not to say trauma in these other periods didn't matter and that it didn't matter a lot. We're just talking relative to one another. So another point that I'm hoping to make here is that sometimes when we encounter kids and they act in ways that don't make sense to us, and they actually make our fight or flight response start to go, sometimes we're kind of confused, like, why are they behaving this way? I don't understand. Sometimes things that happened a long time ago can be influencing how they're behaving in the here and now. And being aware of that and open to that, I think, can go a long way in terms of understanding kids and meeting them where they are. Now, on a more hopeful note, we also found that the degree of a child's current relational health, how much stability they had across their immediate caregiving environment, school caregiving environment, community environment, all of those things we measured when we measured relational health. If their current relational health was strong, they were much more likely to be doing better. And that correlation is a little bit stronger, actually, than the correlation up here. So, two big takeaways from this study. Early life trauma matters, and it can matter a lot. And the current supportive environment that a child is or is not in can also matter a lot in terms of how a child functions on a day-to-day basis. And we kind of took those results a step further. And what you see up here in this top line is kind of what we would expect a typical developmental trajectory of a child to look like. We know that development occurs really, really quickly early in life, and then we start to develop a little more slowly later in life. And we compared that trajectory with the trajectory of the children in our sample who had really significant early life traumas. And what you see is not only do the kids with early life traumas start off a little bit behind, but actually as they age, the gap between them and, quote, typical children — there's really no typical child, every child is unique — widens. And so as you see a child physically mature, they get bigger. They look like they should have a lot more capabilities. What you actually see is sometimes in terms of their problem-solving capabilities, their emotional control, they will actually be even further behind their peers the more that they age. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. I thought you might want to weigh in there.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And one of the things that's ringing out in my mind is thinking about Dr. Perry's words about, kind of those first 18 months of life and how critical they are. Yeah. And one of the things that, I guess anecdotally that we see and hear a lot is, for instance, kids that may have been adopted very early in life or maybe had some trauma very early in life, yeah, may be more likely to end up in programs that are behaviorally focused. The troubled teen industry. We have a lot of people that we support and work with through the Alliance that have kind of entered into these programs, often kind of under the umbrella of, youth that are having difficulty, and they're very behavioral programs, very punitive programs. And there seems to be a lot of correlation there often between, adoption and the foster care system and other things. And I mean, it seems to me that there's, kind of that very early impact and stability. Again, when I heard that, just even listening recently to the, the book, What Happened to You, is mm-hmm. this idea of 18 months. I mean, none of us think about, I mean, we don't have memories from 18 months, but it seems like it's such an important period of time, and your data here seems to kind of show that as well. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting to me is the other part of that you mentioned, which is kind of back to the healing power of relationships. And mm-hmm. I think about that quote that's probably gone around the internet a lot of kind of the I don't remember the exact wording, but having one strong adult relationship in your life and what a difference that can make. I mean, is that consistent with what you see in terms of correlations between perhaps adoption and other types of early childhood, influences?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And what we're learning specifically is Relationships can matter at the time you experience the adversity. And so, we have some other papers out that kind of really more clearly show that the relational milieu that is around you at the time the trauma happens can buffer. So you can have something really bad happen, but you can kind of end up in that resilient, or at least, all right, camp, if you have a lot of relational stability, people to come in afterwards and say, you're safe, we've got you, that something like that's not going to happen again. We're going to work to make sure that it doesn't. And even if you didn't have a lot of good relationships at the time the trauma happened, relationships later can make a
Mhm,
huge
mhm,
difference in terms
mhm.
of kind of telling you, yeah, all that stuff happened and you're safe now. Here
Right.
are the people that are on your side now. Here's what we're going to do for you. When you come to us, you might not trust that I'll act a certain way until you get to know me, and that's what we find a lot with trauma exposed children, especially if it was more relational in nature, the trauma that happened. That can take a long time to build that trust. But as you're building it, and especially once it's in place, it can go a long way in terms of kind of neutralizing really, really negative pasts.
Mhm, mhm. One of the things I can't help but think about, and maybe I'm kind of going out a little too far here in these thoughts, but is the importance of early childhood, the importance of parenting, the need for society even to go upstream and better support families and better support parents. I mean, we come from decades of really poor parenting advice. I mean,
Yeah.
I think about things like, things that have been commonly practiced approaches of letting kids cry it out, or whatever it may be, that are so harmful in that critical part of time. I guess, I just wonder from your perspective, how do we shift that? And hopefully we are. I mean, hopefully we're making progress, but how do you make that shift to get people
Mhm.
really in tune with how important those early experiences are for a child and a human's complete lifespan?
Yeah, I know. Yes, agree that it's hard. Agree that we're starting to see more and more about that. You'll see things about 0 to 3 initiatives and that sort of thing. But,
Mm,
I think something that we always try to get across when we show these data, because a lot of people say that's really depressing. And I'll say, well, I hear that. And I think it's telling us where to intervene.
right.
And also, we're still seeing the power of relationships regardless of when they enter
Mhm,
into the
mhm.
picture, right? But yes, absolutely. I mean, prevention is so so important. So one thing that I think has been hard is what you alluded to a few minutes ago, that if something happens to you when you're 2 months old, yeah, you don't remember it explicitly. You don't have an explicit memory that you would then go share with a therapist later on, right? What happens is that your physiology is retaining memories of how to best adapt and survive in whatever type of environment you were born into. And that physiology is most easily shaped and molded and created the younger that we are, right? Because we kind of come into the world experience expectant, experience dependent. You have a first experience. That first experience is all you have right at first, right? So it kind of shifts everything toward that orientation. And then you kind of continue to build from there. So I think part of it is helping people understand what we mean when we say that early life trauma matters. We're not saying that when they're 5, they're going to be like, you know what, I remember that I would cry for hours in my crib. No, they won't remember that explicitly, but their biology will have been differentially shaped. Different pathways get selected based on that experience. And I think I don't really know when it happened, but I think that we started to expect really too much from parents and kind of forgot that it really actually does take a village. It's literally impossible for one, even 2 people to give a child absolutely everything that they need, and so we need to not see it as a sign of weakness when people need help with their young children. We need to see it as a sign of strength, as that parent really going out and asking for the things that I need, right? Or I think about, leave practices and policies that we need for parents that have young children in their homes. when I think about ratios of children in a classroom, people will say, oh, it's so great. We've got 5-to-1 for the toddlers. And it's like, man, I have a toddler right now. And I feel like we need 5-to-1 in the opposite direction. Like you have them for 5 minutes and then I'll have them for a few minutes. So I think this absolutely has to be part of this broader conversation, that the younger children are, the more that they need. I work with a lot of therapeutic preschools, and they get children when they're 3 or 4, and they're excited because the child is still young, but that's actually past that 0 to 3 window. And even then, these groups will tell me our funders want us to be done in 9 months with the kids. They want the kids to be better in 9 months because, these services are expensive. And I'm sitting here thinking 9 months really might not be enough. And plus, if we can provide a lot now, we might be preventing seclusions and restraints. We might be preventing residential treatment places. We might be preventing a need for special education services all throughout elementary school, for example. So it's hard to think about prevention. It's hard to fund prevention, but it really is critically important. This kind of shows the same thing that I was showing in the other slide, but just to kind of reinforce that idea that children will physically mature, they will biologically mature. But if we haven't had a lot of good intervention to kind of dig in and shore up missed developmental experiences and developmental experiences, developmental experience is not only the bad things that happen to you, but it can also be the things that you miss out on because your environment is chaotic or neglecting, or the trauma took up all the potential experiences that you could have had. And that disrupts a lot of different aspects of our functioning, but perhaps particularly our abilities to problem solve and reason and express ourselves well. And when you think about the reasons that people tend to get punished, it's usually because maybe a child has done something they shouldn't have done. And then kind of immediately at a time when the child might have been kind of tuned up, kind of upset, maybe a little bit hyper aroused, somebody comes in and tells them, hey, you did this wrong and you need to say sorry now, or you need to do this or this now, or else. And then the child becomes much more dysregulated, much more primitive in their behavior. We'll talk about what that looks like even more in the next couple of slides. And then you see kind of people come in with the punishment and give the punishment. And not only does the punishment typically not work because it escalates the child even further in the moment, but also typically the child doesn't learn from the punishment because they're not using the part of their brain that's rational and that's kind of connecting, okay, I behaved in this way, and then you came in and gave me this punishment, for example. They're more in their survival brain. And again, as children age, we start to just expect more of them. But the reality is, if there's been lots of trauma, they will seem much more emotionally regressed compared to their peers as they age.
Just a quick comment here. Our one of our friends here that's watching, Floyd, says it is a village influencing each other, whether intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah.
And that makes me think about some of the work that Dr. Perry mentioned with some of the indigenous populations in New Zealand and some of the practices and things that were done. It seems like we moved, this concept of nuclear family and where we moved in so many directions probably has been a big disadvantage for us as people. I mean, as we've needed that community.
Yes, absolutely. It used to be that multiple generations would live under one roof, or like you alluded to in various cultures, that is still normative. And often we talk about, cultural assets, and I think cultures that have good connections to multiple generations and that realize that they really are interconnected as a system they bring a lot of strength to a child that has a trauma history or has been trauma exposed. Yeah. So just want to kind of, what I've done is talk a lot about what kind of underpins and underlies the neurosequential model, but now just want to talk about the model a little more explicitly. The neurosequential model kind of began as this NMT that you see in the middle, neurosequential model of therapeutics. I think that neurosequential model was really born out of a lot of Dr. Perry's work with children that people were just kind of throwing their hands up in the air. We've tried everything. We are trying to help. We are trying to connect with this child, and our traditional methods aren't working. And, if you just look at the history of psychology, for example, early 1900s to kind of, 50s, 60s, behaviorism was a huge influence, right? And so when people were working with children, that was a really important lens. Now, I don't say that to say that aspects of behavioral psychology aren't still important today, right? But anytime we have a prevailing theme, it can get inappropriately applied. It can get over applied and applied in times and spaces where it's not useful, and sometimes can be detrimental. And so the neurosequential model of therapeutics was kind of the first element of the family of neurosequential models, as maybe I'll call them today. I don't know if anybody else calls them that. There's also the NME, the neurosequential model in education, which is a model that focuses on helping school systems and teachers get children who are ready to learn, get them in the mindset, the emotional, have the emotional readiness to be able to learn. It's hard teaching these days, especially since COVID. We're losing a lot of teachers because they went to school to learn how to teach curriculum, and they're quite good at it. Teachers are quite good at that. Part of the challenge that we have is students who are not in the mental or emotional state to learn. And then teachers are trying to teach and kids aren't in the place to learn. And that can create a lot of frustration for everyone. So the neurosequential model in education is developed to help people develop classrooms and spaces that make it easier for children to be in mental states to learn.
I was just going to jump in real quick, and you mentioned kind of 1950s behaviorism, and you know, um, unfortunately, 1950s behaviorism still has a really significant grip on a lot of the practices in our classrooms today. So,
Right.
that's one of the concerns that we have, is that, it's a lot of the approaches that are kind of grounded in, operant conditioning and the work of Skinner and Piaget and others, that is still really the prevailing knowledge in a lot of our approaches to supporting kids in schools. When in fact, of course, in the 90s, we learned more about neuroscience in the brain than we had learned in all history prior to that. And it seems that, some 20 years later, a lot of that knowledge has still not made its way into education. And broadly speaking, a lot of the programs out there are, based on simple functions of behavior, adult hypotheses,
Mhm.
and reward and consequence models that not only aren't working for the kids that really need the help the most, they're actually counterproductive often. We find that,
Mhm.
it's these
Yeah.
programs that are often really, pushing kids further down that line.
Yeah.
So, that's why I love looking. I mean, when I think about the neurosequential model, I'm thinking about, this is where we should be in terms of moving forward with science and knowing better. Than, it's not just a matter of trying to modify behavior through reward and consequence.
Yeah.
It's about connection in the brain and neuroscience. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Well, and not to take us too far off script, but I like to I like to just go with the conversation too. I think about this a lot. I mean,
Mhm.
I was definitely trained very behaviorally with a very behavioral focus. And I've kind of tried to reflect on, why is it that that is still the first go-to of
Right.
most people? And, whenever there's something that happens in a classroom or a residential center, that where, emotions start to ramp up, we as the teachers, as the therapists, as the line staff, in a residential center, in those sorts of roles, our stress response systems
Mhm, mhm.
get
Absolutely.
elevated as well,
Mhm.
escalate, whatever you want to say. We move up the arousal continuum, as Dr. Perry would call it. And I think we then revert to what's comfortable, and we revert to what's frankly kind of simple, because even though behavioral stuff can be quite nuanced in terms of what will be reinforcing to somebody, all that kind of stuff, sometimes it can feel concrete.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
think people reach for that, and so part of what is challenging about the neurosequential model, and I'm wondering if it's on this next slide, but yeah, when we kind of talk about different components of the neurosequential model, this training and capacity building component of the neurosequential model, to me, and this is red on red, so you can't really see, but to me is so critical. If you want to become certified in the neurosequential model of therapeutics, it's about 150 hours of what we call capacity building, reading about traumatology, neurosociology, reading about how trauma can affect our
Mhm, mhm.
neurobiology and lead to a variety of outcomes. And so the goal of all of that, people start the process and it's like, whoa, I'm not really sure. I might need a semester off, like, is my supervisor going to give me a year to learn all of this stuff? And I get
Sure.
that. But I think what that speaks to is how nuanced and how challenging it can be to really
Mhm,
start to understand children well enough that our fight or flight response doesn't start to escalate when we see
mhm, mhm.
certain types of behaviors.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's time, I think, to learn new ways to respond, and ways that people didn't respond to you when you were young,
Mhm,
when
mhm,
we were in
mhm.
school, right? We often
Right.
parent the way we were parented. And I think we teach the way we were taught. We respond to children the way that we were responded to. And for a lot of people right now, they are responding and reacting to children very behaviorally because that's how they were brought up.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of that kind of compliance mindset, and I think
Mhm.
behaviorism leads itself to that. It's about taking control of a situation and trying to get somebody to comply.
Me and the
And I
adult.
think that in education and law enforcement and other settings, that's causing a lot of trouble. I mean, that's causing a lot of
Yeah,
really traumatic experiences for
yeah,
people. And I think moving to kind of connection and compassion and trying to understand. But you're right, it's hard. It's hard to make the shift. And of course, we know well that a dysregulated adult is not going to help a kid that's having a hard time or becoming dysregulated. So that own we often it seems like there's a tendency to put it all on the child that's having a difficult time. What are
absolutely.
they going to do to change? How are we going to address their behaviors, when in fact there's so much of it on it that's really reflective on us?
Yeah.
What can we do? Because again, we're the adults in the situation, and while it's still not easy for us to always control our emotions or not take
No,
something personally, we certainly have more skills than a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old does in
exactly.
terms of doing some of those things.
Exactly. Absolutely. And I think sometimes, part of what I like about the neurosequential model is it teaches people different ways of responding. And we talk about, sometimes not responding is responding.
Right.
It doesn't mean you're not being the adult in the room. It means you're purposefully doing things like giving children space. It means you're purposefully taking
Right.
yourself out of a situation, right? And that isn't not responding.
Right.
That's actually being in tune with what's going on,
Right.
and very much doing something.
Yeah, taking 2 steps backwards,
Yeah.
doing something to be less threatening, in a situation where a child's feeling escalated. There's so many things you can do that, people think, "Well, you're not doing anything." Well, of course you are. You're helping to lower the temperature.
Exactly, exactly. And I do. I think that sometimes when things start to quote escalate in a classroom, in a treatment facility, people want to be useful. People want
Mhm,
to be
mhm.
helpful, and then you kind of see that like adult gathering phenomenon where more and more adults will come in the room, right? And
Mhm,
then they'll
mhm.
think, oh well, nobody has control, nobody's doing anything. It must be my turn. And then even the fact that we've got more than one adult in the room now, that's already kind of set the child back even more steps, so yes, can get
Well,
quite.
let me be quiet now and let you get
Yeah,
back on your script. I'm sorry.
all good. That's the crux of what we're talking about here. So um the neurosequential model, like this slide shows, many different iterations. They're working on a neurosequential model in caregiving and even a neurosequential model in sport. So in terms of I'll kind of focus mostly on the NMT today, just because I'm a psychologist and therapist, so that's the one that fits me the most. But there are really three components to the neurosequential model of therapeutics. One being that training and capacity building element that I was talking about, alongside readings. People visit or view a variety of webinars, most of them led by Dr. Perry, but other ones led by other experts in the field. Lots and lots of case-based learning. Again, children are so unique and individual, and what happened to one child is different than what happened to another. So a lot of the learning is through case stories and people bringing challenging cases to the experts and saying, how would you think this through? Where would have you made some different decisions? There's a big assessment component to it. So when I showed those data earlier about children's early life experiences, those data come from what we call the NMT metrics. So people who train in the neurosequential model of therapeutics learn how to engage in an assessment of what happened to the child. What was their life like when they were in utero? What was their life like in those early months and weeks? And what is their life like now, not only again within their home, but at school, and when they go and play sports, and when they engage in spiritual activities, all elements of the child's life. So more than kind of trying to log just what mental health symptoms do they have, what do we know that about this child that makes them unique, so that we can better tailor approaches to them and to where they are. We also do assess their current functioning in terms of self-control, how they're doing with relationships, and even kind of how they're doing cognitively with problem solving and reasoning and those sorts of things. Once people fill out a metric, what they get is some feedback related to interventions that could be therapeutic for that child. So interventions like interventions to help them build self-regulation, to help them build tolerance in relationships. Some kids really, really avoid relationships, even though they need the relationships badly. I worked in Denver, and we were doing a mentoring program for children that had recently come into child welfare. And kids that had histories of relationship problems were arguably the kids who needed their mentors the most. And they were the ones who tested their mentors the most. Midway through the program, they were the kids that would say, I don't want you to come back anymore. I never want to see you again. I don't enjoy any of this time I'm spending with you. And for the mentors who were, early graduate students, and by that I mean they were kind of just starting out in their graduate training, that was really hard feedback to take. And a lot of the things we would talk to them about was, this is the most therapeutic thing you can do is stick with them through this, even though they're telling you that they don't want you around. Really, they're trying to say, can I trust you to be around? And so we talk about, given a child's history and given their current presentation, where might we begin with them? Because, similar to that example I gave about kind of relational sensitivities, where kids might need relationships, but they also withdraw from them quickly. We want to make sure we're not doing too much too soon. We want to meet kids where they are. We want the stress of an intervention to be resilience building, instead of a way that vulnerabilities can continue to be built in, I would say. So this slide just kind of refers to really a lot of things we've already talked about throughout the presentation, but the NMT is really built on some key principles of neurodevelopment. One being, just to skip around, I guess, this disproportional valence of early childhood experience that we talked about. Things that happen to us early can really shape how we organize as organisms. The relational mediation of major developmental experiences. There's a reason why children learn better from people than they do from the TV. You can provide the same concept via a television that you can provide yourself to a child, and they will learn it better from you, because we come into the world actually expecting that other people will be an important source of information. We come wanting to reference other people and learning from them and valuing them. And we literally learn better when our experience is relationally mediated, which again can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because if your trauma was relational in nature, that can be very challenging because it can make you wary of relationships later in life. That can be overcome, as we've seen in many, many cases. But important as we think about, what can we do to help? A couple of these concepts that I haven't really talked about, but that are still very central to the NMT and how we think about kids and people. One is sequential organization of the brain. This idea that the lower parts of our brain that develop earlier in life and that are more primitive, those more primitive parts of our brain develop early in life. The more primitive parts of our brain are also the parts of our brain most focused on survival, our temperature, our heart rate, our blood pressure, for example. And so when you have trauma that happens early in life, it's very easy for that trauma to do what we would call to sensitize your stress response system, to make your stress response system overly reactive to life experiences, ready to deploy literally at the drop of the hat. So sometimes you'll be working with a kid and you'll say, I didn't really notice anything that happened, but maybe one kid in the room looked at them in a way that they didn't quite know what to make of it. Maybe the other kid didn't even look at them rudely, but the child with a trauma history didn't know what to make of how the other child looked at them. That really might be enough, depending on their early life history, to result in a full-blown stress response and to result in really regressed behaviors, to result in the child kind of operating more primitively. And the brain really develops in a sequential fashion. And so if early in life the brain has learned, hey, life is going to be stressful, then the rest of the brain gets built upon this more primitive brain, and kind of the whole system becomes oriented towards survival instead of oriented toward, tasks that arguably help us in school, help us make friends, tasks that are more related to affiliation and getting along in the social world and having concrete thought and abstract thought, and kind of understanding how to solve problems. None of us are good at solving problems when we're stressed, but trauma-exposed children probably have a harder time with it because they have spent so much of their life focused on survival that they have spent less of their life practicing these reasoning and problem solving skills. If I act in this way, this might be the outcome. Therefore, I'm going to inhibit that impulse and not act in that way. That type of thing, they often haven't had as much practice with.
Quick question for you, kind of thinking about the brain piece here.
Yeah.
One of the things that we sometimes see is that sometimes, parents, caregivers, teachers, others, have a tendency to think about kids as being miniature adults.
Yeah.
They think about their brains as being developed at the same level. And of course, we hear very young kids being called manipulative, attention seeking, all these
Yeah.
different things. And of course, there's some knowledge we have about the way the brain develops kind of from back to front and kind of that process of myelination and, kind of the last areas of our brain really being, the portion of the brain responsible for executive function. So if we think about, what you're showing here, and then we think about that brain development process, it seems that we often have unrealistic expectations on children, where they may not even have the developmental capacity to do things.
Yeah.
Is that true, or is?
I think that's exactly my view on it.
Okay,
That's at least a concise way of saying what I'm trying to say.
okay.
I think we often have inappropriate expectations for children. And quite frankly, for ourselves, for our
Mhm,
coworkers, for our
mhm.
colleagues, we forget that a brain under stress acts differently than a brain that isn't under stress. And I'm moving forward to this slide just to kind of show this concept in a different way.
Mhm,
But,
mhm,
when we're mentally calm, we tend to think more abstractly.
mhm,
We are
mhm.
creative. I'll be honest, most of the time I'm not mentally calm because I don't know, I have a job and some kids. And so I tend to be more concrete and on alert than I might want to be. And sometimes I'll say, I need a break so I can go think about the next project I want to do,
Right.
have the capacity to even think about that. Well, the trauma exposed child might start their day in a more alert alarm state, such that they're concrete at best in their cognition and reasoning, and emotional just when they start their day. And it can take something very small to make someone become reactive and perhaps downright reflexive, and so when we start to see resistance from a child, they first start to back away, or they kind of just stare at us instead of responding, instead of saying, did you hear me, which probably moves them up the arousal continuum toward reactivity, all out defiance and aggression. We might need to just wait that out, right? Okay, I said something, they probably did hear me.
Right.
But they might be processing it. They might be deciding the most advantageous way to react and respond. But no, we want an answer now. I got a whole classroom full of kids, and I don't mean anything ill toward teachers. I think they have the hardest job in the world.
Yeah. But as those demands increase, the escalation increases, and the situation gets worse, not better.
Exactly.
We had a great comment or a question here from Gail, and Gail's actually in Australia, so it's probably bright and early tomorrow morning there in Australia. Gail said that she was interested in your thoughts on how disability, in particular ADHD or autism, impact this model, and does it and in turn, does it change the use of the model in the classroom?
That is a great point. So I've spent a lot of time talking about how, the model kind of perhaps came about with trauma exposed children in mind. But what I think Dr. Perry would say if he was here today is the neurosequential model is not for trauma exposed children. The neurosequential model is for children. And it is a way for us to think about where children are in terms of their ability to problem solve, inhibit impulses, have self-control, all of that, and then to get our expectations in line with where they currently are, so that the challenge that we provide to them isn't so much that it causes stress, and when you think about all the secondary concerns that, for example, a child with ADHD might experience, we know that if you have ADHD, that then you might have risk for social problems. You might have risk for anxiety and depression. I didn't, live up to the expectations people had of me because it was harder for me to pay attention. It was harder for me to inhibit impulses. And so I don't know if this necessarily answers the question, but we have increasingly seen the model be applied to work with children diagnosed with autism and ADHD and really a range of developmental issues.
Yeah. Well, and I love your answer. The Dr. Perry on your shoulder kind of answer that he would say it's for all kids. And I would agree. One of the things Gail and I have actually talked about, and I've said frequently with no scientific rigor behind it. So excuse me, from coming from the science standpoint, but I think there's a huge intersection between trauma and disability. And when you think about those things you just mentioned, the difficulty in social situations, or maybe it's a difficulty communicating the things you're trying to communicate. If you think about the inherent stress and the inherent potential for trauma related to some of those difficulties, it seems like, there's a really big crossover there between the two. And of course, what we know about challenging, behaviors of concern is that it's kids that are kids with disabilities that are often the ones that are on the other side of these punitive, interventions.
Sorry, I'm just plugging in my computer. I'm not leaving. I agreed with everything you said.
I thought it was my lack of science, and you're like, you have nothing to back that
wrap
up.
this up early.
Sorry. All right. Well, let me let you go on, because I do want to let you know we're around 4:28 now, just because I know you've got a hard stop around a quarter up.
We've gotten to what I kind of like is when we do this discussion thing, then I start going through my slides. I'm like, hey, we've kind of already been there. One thing I wanted to say though, in terms of, because everybody's kind of like, hey, what do we do? What do we do differently? What do we do about it? And I'm like, I know, $1 million question. And but the neurosequential model is really a lens that the goal is to help you think about what the child's mental state might be, what their developmental capacity might be, what might be reasonable expectations to have for a child, also, where am I on the arousal
Mm,
continuum, and how's that
mhm.
influencing how I'm reacting and responding?
So critical.
And we sometimes we kind of break the NMT down, or the neurosequential model, and we say, people, you got to think regulate, relate, and reason. And if a child is very dysregulated, if they are aggressive, if they are, not engaging in behaviors, they're not able to do things that they can do, but they're not doing them right now, they're probably pretty dysregulated, and they're probably operating from a lower part of their brain. And we want to help them regulate, give them space, allow them to work with fidget toys, let them have a break, let them go for a walk. Please don't take their, recess, or their, downtime, right? Because they need that to regulate. And once we get a little regulated, then it's easier to relate, to connect with them, to say hello, how was your day, and get that smile and that social engagement, and to build that relationship with them. Sometimes I think we try to relate to people when they're not regulated, and then we're like, they don't like me. Well, maybe not. Maybe it just wasn't the time for that type of interaction. And then we can reason with them. And kids don't take direction well from people they don't know. you know, they don't, sometimes when they're upset, they don't want anybody to say something about their behavior and how it should be different, depending on how dysregulated they might be. But it's really hard to take feedback from somebody that you don't have a solid relationship with. But we see that happen a lot. And I think we see that happen in a lot of instances that do end up escalating, and resulting in something like a restraint.
Yeah, and that's hard for all of us, right? I mean, would be easy for me to take, feedback sometimes from somebody that you don't know, or especially critical feedback,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes our expectations, I mean, I'm a big believer that we shouldn't do things to kids that we wouldn't do to adults, and kind of, as
I
Carol
like
said
that
here in a
statement.
comment, she
Yeah.
said, as crazy as it sounds, I say we start by listening to the kid, and I mean, again,
Yeah.
kids want to see, feel valued and heard and seen, and all of those things. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's critical.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to take that statement with me. I like that one. Well, I want to show some data here, just because it's so relevant to the initiative that you all have going on with the Alliance. And I'm just a really big fan of the movement. It's so important. We really can eliminate restraints. It
Mhm.
really is an achievable goal. So one thing that we saw when groups started implementing the neurosequential model in their day treatment settings, in their residential treatment settings, in their psychiatric hospital settings, people started to say to us, we do not have the same amount of restraints we used to have. Critical incidences, children breaking things, trying to run away, those sorts of incidences, they're basically gone. And we didn't purposefully implement restraint reduction procedures, right? They were kind of noticing this as a byproduct. And so we wanted to know if there was any kind of statistical backing to the anecdotal observations that our partners were showing us. And a few years ago, we worked with 10 different groups and had them submit kind of their average daily rates of things like restraints and critical incidences to us. And we mapped those onto kind of where they had been in the NMT implementation process. So the first kind of box that you see in each of these 10 boxes is pre-NMT, just kind of their
Mhm,
baseline
mhm.
rates of restraints. And then the second box is kind of what we called the introduction to NMT phase. They started to learn about it. Maybe they listened to some talks that Dr. Perry had given, did some reading. Maybe the staff went to a talk or two. We started to see drops. We saw the lowest rates really across the board at this kind of middle phase, the NMT phase 1, which is when these sites were actually going through what we call a site certification in NMT. And when they were in the first phase of that, a really active phase where everything's very new, buy-in is probably really, really strong. People are buying into this new way of viewing children and interacting with them. Saw the rates really significantly decrease, and really kind of stay there through the phase 2 of certification and the maintenance phase. we did kind of see some upticks during the maintenance phase. It's always hard to implement and continue to implement a new approach. You get staff turnover, you get drift, that sort of thing. But seeing that uptick also, gave us ideas. How do we implement this better, provide better support, but also, compare that maintenance phase to the pre-NMT rates of seclusion and restraint and other critical incidences, and you're still seeing a really significant dip. And we also did a really rough, financial analysis of this. But some people have said that, each restraint might cost between $300 and $500, in terms of person hours and logging things about it and all the different people that end up being involved. And so some really kind of amazing financial savings potentially as well. With this slide kind of showing the same thing with critical incidences. So restraints were kind of a different thing, and then critical incidents were a variety of different things, but we see the same pattern here. So we were excited about that because, again, the whole point of NMT wasn't developed to reduce restraint, but we saw a lot of utility. And, we thought about, well, why is this? What are we seeing here? And we thought, this clinical approach probably addresses some core deficits in the clinical population and provides staff with new ways about thinking about and responding to patient behaviors. I think it also took some of the mystery out of child behaviors, which I think did a lot to de-escalate the adults. Before the NMT, children were probably behaving in ways that the adults perceived as really confusing, unpredictable, in ways that they felt would only escalate without intervention. But then in learning about the model and learning about how trauma affects children and learning about neurodevelopment, I think adults felt a lot more empowered and a lot less vulnerable themselves. That's just us hypothesizing, but that really is kind of where our minds went in terms of understanding, why is it that we saw this big impact?
Yeah, even that initial drop.
Yes.
One of the things that we've commonly said, and again, I don't have a lot of scientific rigor behind this, although I want to get your data that you were sharing a minute ago, and that is that when people resolve to, and you're done with your slideshow here.
All
okay,
done.
I'm gonna take that off. But when people resolve to do something to reduce restraint and seclusion, they could drop their numbers by 50% just by making that decision and kind of deciding that they want to do something. I mean, even, so much emphasis too, kind of on the adult or the caregiver side of things. It's very easy to focus on the child. And again, the child is the person with the least amount of skills and ability in the equation. But very often we're putting all the expectations on the child to change versus the way that we are doing things. So I'd love to get that data if you can share it. And I don't know if you have a case study written up, but that would be something great to share, because that's a point we're frequently trying to make, is that not only can you, but here's evidence. And we've seen others that have done, again, there's various approaches to doing some of this work, but others that have had similar experiences where not only have they been able to eliminate seclusion, reduce restraint significantly, they've ended up saving lots of money in the interim. That wasn't an intended consequence. It was just a matter of fewer injuries to the teachers and staff, fewer injuries to students. So there's some positive outcomes. So I know we just have a few minutes, and I want to invite members that are watching to ask any questions that they might have. But I want to begin by asking you two quick questions. So you've talked about, and you and I have talked about this a little before, how, again, at the beginning, the neurosequential model of therapy, neurosequential model in education, different kind of areas that this is focused on. So one of the things that I was thinking, again, kind of thinking about the connection of all this to our audience here, when we think about the neurosequential model of therapy, of course, there are therapists that are going through this very intensive training. As you mentioned, there's a lot to this. Is there a directory of providers that are trained in this model?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I actually have that on one of my slides, but there is a kind of a geo map that is maybe I can find the URL and shoot it over to you. But even if you Google like neurosequential model geo map, it would probably come up. And there are providers trained throughout the world,
Okay.
in many different countries and parts of the US. And I actually used that map when I came to Kansas City to say, who in my town, does this? And,
Right.
I've gotten to have coffee with those individuals and say, how are you using it in your school? How are you using it in your clinical practice? So that I think is a great resource if you're looking for somebody to consult with or to treat a certain child or do a training, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm thinking is that, of course, we have a pretty broad audience. We have parents of kids that have been restrained and secluded. We have self advocates, autistic self advocates in our
Mhm,
community.
mhm,
We also have educators. We have administrators. We have attorneys,
mhm.
related professionals. A lot of different people. But we do have a lot of people in our community that have gone through situations where their kids have been restrained and secluded and significantly traumatized.
Yeah.
And one of the recommendations, of course, is to don't take that trauma lightly. We want to get help for our kids that have been through things like this. And my thought here, and tell me if I'm wrong, but certainly having somebody with experience and background in the neurosequential model could be really helpful in helping a
Mm.
parent of a kid that has been traumatized. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I certainly would. I think that learning about the neurosequential model has helped me in a variety of aspects of my professional functioning, and so I think that learning could be uniquely valuable, I think, to people whose children have experienced the trauma of seclusion.
Mhm. Now, are there, and I know, again, there's different areas of the, kind of the model and different people doing different things. And I know you're kind of from the therapy standpoint, but are there schools across the nation that are using this model? I know there's a lot to implement it, but are
Mhm.
there places across the country, or even across the world that are leveraging the neurosequential model? And can you say anything about, kind of the
Yeah,
experiences they're
no,
having?
absolutely. So, also a geo map available for the schools that are using it. There are schools nearby me and lots of schools in Kansas, lots of schools in Ohio, but really, I think nearly every state there is at least a school.
Mhm, mhm.
And similar to the data that we see in terms of restraint reduction, what we are seeing at schools that really from administration down are using the enemy. So there are lots of places where a teacher just learned a lot about the enemy, right? And
Mhm,
they
mhm,
changed their classroom. But there are places where administration has said, we're going to do this and we're going to do it at all levels of our school. And their data related to reduced suspensions and reduced out of class time are really, really impressive. And again, out of class time is hard because sometimes you want to take a child out of class to allow them space to regulate. But when people have really drilled down and said, no, we're talking about out of class time that would have been punitive in nature. Those are some of the biggest outcomes that we're seeing. We're seeing schools be less punitive and more trauma responsive.
mhm, 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 mhm. Okay, so I know we only have a couple minutes, and I want to make sure I get you out on time because I know you have a parental obligation as well.
Yes.
And I understand that because before our call, I was picking up my daughter, and I slid into my seat right before you and I got
Yep.
on here.
That's how it goes.
I had a couple questions here. One was asking about if there was an opportunity to potentially get a copy of the slides. And I will say that we will, of course, put a copy of this presentation. This is recorded, so that will be available. I don't know if your slides are something. I know some people like to make them available or not.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I can work with Dr. Perry to get elements of them
okay,
available
okay,
for sure.
okay, sounds good. Is there any kind of training for parents that might want to learn more about the model and
Yeah.
how they can leverage the model within their own homes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I'm trying to like think of the exact URL off of the top of my head, but Dr. Perry did a lot of recordings about things like stress and how stress affects us during the COVID crisis. Wanted to get information into the hands of
Hmm.
people who could use it right away. So,
Hmm.
on the Neurosequential Network website, there are lots of links and recordings, especially under the COVID-19 subsection, that are free for all. And I think parents would benefit greatly from just perusing those. They're
Hmm.
short, they're digestible. Dr. Perry likes to be neurobiologically respectful in his teaching. And he's like, not too much information, Erin, because he knows I like to throw it all out there and hope it lands. He's like, little bits. Um, So that's available. And also, I haven't been engaged with the neurosequential model in caregiving much lately, but that is certainly the goal of the
Mhm, mhm,
neurosequential model in caregiving,
mhm, mhm,
is that that information is provided to caregivers in ways that you don't have to have a degree in mental
mhm,
health
mhm, mhm.
to digest it and to be able to use it.
Yeah, and of course, I'll make a mention here that the book is also an excellent resource. The latest
Agreed.
book, yeah, what happened to you, and kind of reframing from what's wrong with you to kids, and understanding kind of what they've experienced, and all of us have had things that have happened to us that have made us us. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up because I know we are 1 minute from the time. I
We
promised
are,
to
yes.
let you go.
I think we got it all in.
Yeah, yeah, no, I really appreciate this, and really enjoy the conversation
Me
and
too.
you explaining the model. And really, I think this has been very helpful. I'd love to have you back another time, and we can talk
Yeah.
some more. If Dr. Perry ever has some time, I'd love to have him on as well, and maybe talk about the book. So if you have any pull there,
That's right. I'll pass that along with
put in a good word for us.
all my powers.
Absolutely, absolutely. But this has really been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes,
I've
thank
got a few
you.
announcements, but I will let you go. Any final words before you go?
No, just thanks so much for the interest and opportunity to highlight these issues. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah. Have a good
All right,
day.
we'll see you later. Thanks. All right, and for those of you that are still here, I hope you enjoyed today's event. As always, I know I enjoy these events quite a bit. We have a lot of amazing guests, and talking about things we can be doing to make a positive difference. And for you, I encourage you to share these sessions. They're available on YouTube and Facebook after the fact as a recording. Share them with other parents, share them with educators, share them with your colleagues. The more we can get awareness about the better things we can be doing, the better off we're all going to be. I do want to remind you, we'll be back again in another 2 weeks. I don't have a slide ready to talk about the next presentation, but I will tell you that we've got another great guest coming up in about 2 weeks. Look on our Facebook page for more information about that. And as always, thank you so much. Thank you for being part of the community, and thank you for joining us in trying to do better things and better serve everyone. So appreciate it. You all take care, and we'll see you again soon.